This lesson is part of the series about the value of an education. Why should we go to school? And in this lesson, we'll offer the idea that an education allows you to look with new eyes. Now, the idea of looking with new eyes can be traced back to a quote from a now-dead author. The only true voyage of discovery would be not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another. And we could simplify that quote in the following way. Discovery is not only about traveling to new places, but is often about looking with new eyes. And so this is what an education can do for you. It can equip us with new eyes with which to see the same old world. And we can see the same old world with a new understanding and appreciation. Now, in another lesson, the example I used was the chloroplast, those green structures inside plant cells that perform photosynthesis. In this lesson, the example will be a rock. In this case, it's a space rock. It would be like an asteroid. But this is the kind of rock that made up rocky planets in the early solar system. Now, of course, we're familiar with rocks. They're quite literally all over the place, even under our feet as we walk around the planet. Here we see some rocks in Utah that make for a nice setting for an afternoon hike. Or if you return in the evening when there's a new moon, you might capture the Milky Way in the distance. And here are some more rocks. These towering structures are called hoodoos. Again, erosion left these structures standing. And again, they make for a nice setting for an afternoon hike or the foreground for a Milky Way photograph. In Joshua Tree, lots of people like to climb all over the rocks. And here on the shores of Maui, we see volcanic rocks. Again, a beautiful setting for a nighttime picture of the Milky Way. In this scene, we see a canyon. These rocky canyon walls were carved by the action of a river over millions of years. So, in this lesson then, we're going to look with new eyes upon this rock. Without an education, we might not have very many interesting thoughts about this rock. But with an education, we can see this rock in a whole new way. So, let's take a journey. First, rocks are composed of elements that were originally forged in the cores of stars. So, stars make the elements found in rocks. And if you have an education, you will know that stars created the periodic table of the elements. Early in the universe, the only two elements that existed were hydrogen and helium, with a little bit of lithium. But it was the formation of stars that allowed our universe to make all these other kinds of elements. In fact, when some heavy stars, some massive stars, run out of nuclear fuel with which they were doing nuclear fusion, they can explode in what's called a supernova. Here's the remnants, the remains of a supernova. We call it the Crab Nebula. Well, all those elements that were forged inside stars get blasted back out into space. And here we see on the right some of the symbols for the elements: oxygen, calcium, nitrogen, nickel, hydrogen, carbon, silicon, iron, etc. So stars then, they forge these heavier elements and then blast them back out into space, where then they can assemble over here on the left into little particles of matter, what we would call little rocks. So this material, rocks and metal and ice, that's the material with which to make rocky planets. So it's kind of a truism that rocks are the building blocks of rocky planets. And now we've seen the origin of rocks is related to stars. Now let's really make that connection more clear. Over on the right here we have a cutaway of the planet. We know the core of the planet is mostly iron and nickel, and then we have the outer core and the mantle made of different kinds of elements. But iron is a major constituent. As well, there's lots of oxygen in the rocks that form the crust of the planet. So if we focus on iron and oxygen as two elements that are found in abundance on the planet, now consider this single supernova remnant. This is Cassiopeia A, the remains of a supernova. So one star exploded. And consider how much iron and oxygen were produced by this one star. So down here are the numbers. This Cassiopeia A supernova is estimated to have ejected 70,000 Earth masses of iron and 1 million Earth masses of oxygen. In other words, one star ejected enough iron to make 70,000 Earths and enough oxygen to make 1 million Earths. So rocky planets are tiny, tiny objects in comparison to stars. Stars are huge, and when they explode, they eject lots of material to make new rocky planets. Now, if we continue on with our story, around 4 billion years ago, the rocks that made up the Earth, well, some of those rocks had a role in the origin of life. Many scientists argue that life originated underneath the oceans in these rocky structures, these hydrothermal vents. They were rocky nurseries where complex chemistry occurred. And in this picture on the right, we see an artist's rendering of the first living cells emerging from their rocky nurseries. So rocks provided sort of not only a chamber in which chemistry occurred, but the materials in the walls of these rocky chambers helped to catalyze chemical reactions and produce the molecules that assembled into living cells. So in a very important way, rocks contributed to the origin of life. So what a story it is, our story of planet Earth. We go from a lifeless rock to a rock with life, and the key step was the origin of life. Living cells emerged from chemistry on a rocky planet. So again, if we don't have an education, we're limited in our understanding and appreciation of this rock, a space rock. But with an education, we can see how it is connected to lots of other things in our universe, things that we might care about. So rocks ultimately are made of elements that were forged inside stars, and supernova blasted those elements back out into space, where they assembled into rocks like asteroids that assembled into rocky planets. And on one of those rocky planets, at least that we know of, those rocks contributed to the origin of life. So stars make the elements found in rocky planets. Some rocky planets can make life, and rocks and life are made of star stuff. So that's what an education can do for you. We can see the world with new eyes. Previously, we didn't have many interesting thoughts about this rock, but with an education, we can tell a story, and it's a pretty grand story at that.